Good evening, and welcome to the Smithsonian American Art Museum's annual James Dicke Lecture, given tonight by Tala Madani. I'm Sarah Newman, SAAM's Curator of Contemporary Art, and I have lots of things I'd like to say about Tala and her work, but first I just want to take a moment to go over a few details about the program tonight. We'll have time at the end for questions, so please put them in the Q&A box. We'll share key information with you throughout the program via the chat box. We also ask that you not close your browser window, as a survey will appear afterwards, and we appreciate your feedback about the program today. This program is being recorded and will be available on our website. It is also being live captioned, which you can access with the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And now to the program itself. This is actually a really gratifying moment for us at the museum because it is the first time that the person giving our annual Dicke Lecture is also the winner of our James Dicke Prize. We give that award to an artist under 50 years old who we believe is making the strongest, most compelling work in the country today. It certainly speaks to how strongly we felt about Tala Madani's work that we both wanted to recognize it this way, and also that we wanted to hear her speak and teach us more about it. I believe that's because her work offers us a way to conceive of the anxieties and the darkness of our times with humor, absurdity, and raw honesty. In her paintings and hand-drawn animations, she skewers images of history and authority, infusing her universe of bald, aging men and mothers and their children with equal parts slapstick and menace. Yet her work never feels like mere satire. There's deep personal resonance and an emotional intensity that strikes an almost paradoxical balance between mystery and revealing too much. Obviously, I find her work incredibly powerful, and part of that power lies in its sense of enigma and the difficulty I have with putting my finger exactly on what it's doing. I'm really looking forward to hearing the words and the ideas that she uses to describe it this evening. Tala Madani was born in Tehran, Iran in 1981 and currently lives in Los Angeles. She received a degree in political science and visual arts from Oregon State University in 2004, before earning her MA in painting from Yale in 2006. She's had won artist exhibitions at Vienna Successions in Austria, at the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo, at the MIT Visual Arts Center in Boston, and at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, among others. And she has a major exhibition opening this fall at MoCA in LA. Please join me in welcoming Tala Madani.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was an amazing introduction. Thank you. That was, yeah, so we are, I think, can everybody see me? We are here together in webinar. I see the number of the attendees and I really wish I could see you. It's been a few years since I received the award. So we've been trying to schedule this, and obviously we've been living in the world that we've been living in. So we're doing this via Zoom. And in preparing the lecture, I was really faced with the kind of the difficulty of how, the problem of not seeing the audience, for instance, not feeling where you guys are coming from. What's really interesting is that probably most people are watching this from the comfort of their own home. And for so many artists, music is experienced through through the intimacy of one's own personal time, but usually with visual arts, painting, sculptures, drawings, you're going to a site-specific place, a museum, a gallery, sometimes your own house, if you have a collection. But the experience is barely ever that intimate. Now, this talk right now is quite intimate. Sadly, I'm not a performer though, so the work itself is not going to be coming to you intimately, but we are, but I'm privileged to be in your personal space right now, is what I'm trying to say. And so I'll start, preparing this talk that we're going to have, this one-sided talk for the most part. I realized that if I were to prepare a lecture of the work, about the work, you know, that kind of use of language, that kind of strategic use of language would be me trying to convince you of something, me trying to tell you something. And that was not interesting for me. And so I haven't prepared it, and I wanted to sort of face my own silences, my own discomfort with doing this, to see what is of optimal importance for the work to come out in that moment of pressure. I only share that just to say that this is similar to my process in painting, that a kind of an openness about not having everything planned for the work is part of what gets the most important things to come out, to kind of not be in a kind of a strategic use of the medium. Allows it that kind of openness to be. I'll put up a slide just so that you'll have something else to look at besides me, but I'll keep talking more generally for a while until we talk about painting specifically. So I will share a screen if you would be bearing with me for a moment. I'll share this screen and we'll go from there. Okay. And then this way I will slideshow and hopefully you'll see a painting better than just myself talking. So, but I just want you to see that painting. So for now, we'll just stop it right there. Yeah. So, yeah, I could have titled this talk in a few different things. I've been thinking a lot about the problem for paintings, the problem of having to look good. I'm always fascinated by why do paintings have to have any kind of an aesthetic experience. I'm still puzzled with the idea that you know, form and function might have to meet, and I don't even know if that's entirely true. But to say that I think it's such a burden for paintings to have to look good on any level, and we can talk extensively about that later on. But that's something. This idea of the look of a thing is quite a problem for me. For me, paintings are always conceptual. It's just about an idea. So mitigating how everything else, you know, becomes superfluous. So, and I think it's interesting because it speaks obviously to our time. I mean, paintings existed for forever, since humans have existed. Art has existed. So for our time, I guess there is, for me, a sensitivity to the excesses of glitz, glamour, the presentation. Side note, I think it's interesting. I just saw a YouTube video made by Russell Brand. He just released it, that he's talking about the events of the Oscars. And he's talking about how disturbing it was, because it kind of broke the facade of the Oscars being a space for kind of a festival of meaninglessness, how that the sort of showing of real feelings and the real anger that was presented there, it broke that that image, that spectacle. And how maybe today with our collective our collective sort of social problems, that if the Oscars, if that kind of ceremony was ever a bandage on a kind of a social wound, that maybe the bandage is not big enough now, maybe that it's just somehow not meeting the social need anymore. It's kind of falling apart. It can't hold it. And so the question of what are all social wounds is interesting for me. See, I think it's for artists and for the artworks not to become a symptom of their time, but to become kind of readers of their time is a goal. And this talk is actually quite interesting, because so much like facing a painting, which is a void, this talk right now, even though there's an audience, I am speaking to, for all intents and purposes, a void right now. So we will see what happens with that. But yes, similar. So back to this problem of reality and masking reality. Yeah. So, similarly with sitcoms, I think it's so interesting that right now we're in the golden age of television, because somehow psychologically we have this need, go to the next slide. We have this need for familiarity, repetition. So sitcoms and miniseries have become very popular because we need to see, we don't want a change, we don't want, we just want to know what to expect. We want to have a familiarity with things. So this I find also really interesting in our need for that. Somehow this all got me to become really interested in this idea of a blur. I found myself being drawn to the blur constantly, constantly trying to find reasons to paint something blurry. So I got a couple of eye charts and I try to look at them in a blurry way. I wear glasses, but not super heavy ones. And let me see. And became interested in the blur basically. And different kinds of blurs. And this, I think, it to me was a similar. I was sort of thinking about the similar thing that the sitcoms provide, a kind of a distancing, a kind of a desire not to really see reality as it is. People have used the blur a lot. Obviously, art historically, we have Richter's blurs, the photographic blur, which are a different kind of blur because that talks about the change in history or how history gets read differently. Blur also as a way of thinking about the incomprehensible, the kind of the God blur, the inconceivable, the cloud blur is also quite interesting. But yeah, I found this, and so there's, I think this desire not to see clearly right now is, these are called concrete shadows, and there are a series about shadows of someone maybe on a building. You know, their shadows on a building, and maybe they fall and maybe they don't fall. I'm kind of holding them on a purgatory right now of them just shadows on the building. They're in my studio. I've kind of got a few recent paintings to show you guys. That's where they're going. Or a fan blur, a blurring that would happen with something that's in a space, or blurring that is something like pulling your face, blurs it, face off. But while we're in fan blur, I will share an animation actually. This animation is called The Fan. Stop sharing. I made that animation right after the lockdown. It's very short. a kind of a you're doomed if you do, if you're doomed if you don't problem. The what happens to him? Yeah, he just, the fan gets you, whatever you do. The yeah, I'm thinking very much about mediation, mediated reality, mediated truths, mediated experiences. I'll stop sharing this and go back to the slides again. So this this also occupied my mind while I was thinking about, I'll share with you a few works and then go back to this, where I made these corner projections, which are very much about a projector, a mediated reality, projecting onto, this is the detail, onto a crowd of people, or is it the crowd itself a projection? These were corner paintings that would make each other, one would make the other, so they're sort of juxtapose their response to each other, and playing a lot with light, this source of light, light being one of the biggest themes of art history, and our light's coming from an instrument, a projector, a medium apparatus. So this was something that had caught me for a while, playing with these paintings. I'll let it run through. So again, having dealing with this idea of why paintings have to look good. Try very often not to make paintings that look good, actually, as a way of not valuing the primacy of a kind of an aesthetic experience, but instead valuing a kind of energy displacement from me to the work. That being its register of if it's working or not any kind of a balance, not any kind of a traditional balance of a look of a thing. These are Blackboard paintings. I'm looking for some Blackboard paintings where this idea of copying a form, assimilating, cultural assimilation was coming to play, and education. A kind of ideas about reaction to education as a defensive mechanism. So as well, so that basically the origins of, let's say, the suggestions that the origins of prejudice are a kind of a reaction to education. So as a self-protective mechanism, you revert back to what you know. You want to reject something new, or you just copy and assimilate. And what is this one? Yeah. Processing. Can you hold on this for a while? Yeah, so I guess a lot of times in my work, I do have a lot of suspicions of what we hold to value, whether it be education systems, not to suggest that, I guess questioning ways that we do education, not to question learning itself. And then the forms also then, collaborate with me on that. The forms revert to something that's not very academic. as a position, I guess I'm also I have something against nostalgia of all kinds. And when I'm thinking about painting, I try to really push away any idea of any seduction of nostalgia, because as a nostalgia as an experience in one's own sort of body is conservative. So trying not to propagate that through the work itself, but trying to kind of just deal with the brush and the subject in a very matter-of-fact way, without a kind of a romanticism that would then turn into the past, painting's history and nostalgia. That's kind of I feel really strongly about that. And we are living in a very precarious moment right now, where so much of our cultural production is dominated by market interests. And so how do we resist the seductions of having to look good, of also nostalgia? And I think that's quite paramount. Again, not to have the work become symptomatic of the times, but actually to be the reader of the time, and perhaps to find ways of finding ways through the times. It's very difficult having this conversation without an audience that you can see and their reactions, etc. Evolution of some kind to something worse. I don't know, we can borrow a title from pop culture. We can call it History of Violence. I think this one's called Perfect Copy. I'll go back and rethink about some of the ones that I skipped over, the images. But even what to choose for the talk was very interesting. Artists are never the best curators of their own work. So it became, but this is also, again, further excuses to paint the blur. I will go back to the problem of the blur. There's something about the sort of difficulty of seeing clarity, the difficulty of wanting hard marks, so the blur became very attractive to me as a way of processing reality, in the same way that humor does generally for me. The softness of the edges became a way of living with them. And it became super interesting as I learned after I had my first child that children, when they're born, have no clear eyesight. At first, they see everything is a blur except from 18 to 12 inches. And everything is in black and white. And as they grow, they see maybe first green, then red, the colors come into their faculty. So the blur as a defensive mechanism against excess information that we can't process, perhaps became quite interesting. So for me, the blur was non-photographic interest, was more interesting in terms of a body response. And then again, reasons to find ways of doing the blur. I thought maybe the fan again could be a way of blurring the figure. Or again, the child perspective. I think this one's called Spectral Disco. It's very difficult to talk about paintings, I find, because the minute you start suggesting of what they're supposed to do or what they're doing, they stop doing that thing. It's the old philosophical advantage of, if you're trying to hammer a nail with a hammer, the minute you start thinking about velocity and speed and direction, you're no longer hammering anything. You're only thinking about the problem. And so the issue with painting is, of course, this medium is impossible because it's a digital medium and you cannot have an experience at all with it. Aldous Huxley, I'm mispronouncing Huxley, wrote in Phenomenology of Sight or Light. It was very interesting because he was talking about how basically being under the influence of psychedelics is and reality under that influence is ever more rewarding than a painted reality. So he was suggesting that artworks can never be as sublime as reality, because when you can have that experience, psychedelic experience, that surpasses all art experiences. One of the biggest problems that I can't imagine for such a brilliant man, he made this error, I could say, was that he was looking at a reproduction of a Van Gogh painting in a catalog, in a book of Van Gogh's, and discussing that under an influence of psychedelics, a chair that he lives with is by far more interesting than this image of the painting of the chair of Van Gogh. And so who knows what is more exciting, but certainly the image of the painting in a book would, of course, never be that exciting. And so now we can talk about NFTs, for instance, about that the experience of the artwork is always object to body. It's never image, not paintings. Certainly we could talk about, caricatures or, other forms of artworks that could be mediated through a screen or newspaper, but a painting is always a physical object, and it has things that it will tell you with a physical presence. All that just to say this is that we can't look at paintings at all. We can't have an experience in this form. In the same way that we can't have a cinematic experience on our screens. Tarantino talks about that a lot, that cinema is supposed to be experienced this big. These are another corner paintings that the paintings inform each other, one side to the other. A little bit of meeting formalism on your other side. This is one panel. This is the detail of the other panel. Again, shadows as a way of enjoying blurs. Shadows as a way of indulging in non-direct communication and other things. Detail. I only put this to give the audience a sense that we're in a safe place. There's a disco, there's a bunny, we're fine, we're okay. Also became very interested. These are somehow, I guess, informed a little bit by the animations. So a bit of sequencing. But interested in this notion of time in painting. More projections. This one is a bit of a fallen projection, just a bit tilted. It's no longer, again, the reality is falling apart, maybe. It can't hold itself. More ideas about immediate experiences. somehow Mothmen, wanting light. I guess a preoccupation with light. I could stop here and open it to questions. And because I feel like that could also be quite prompting to go further, much further. But before I do that, I'll share one more animation with you. Look at this. And this one is called Plane Chaser.
Prepare for takeoff.
Sorry about my silence, but yes. Okay, so I will now stop sharing. Hi, Sarah. I can't hear you.
Sorry. Thank you so much for that. I was really just enjoying.
It was
I'm sorry.
truncated. It was truncated. The format of my white background and you know the emptiness of the room. But we continue with the conversation.
Yeah, I was just really enjoying spending time with the images and thinking about how different they would be in person, as you were talking about that, because they are very, they're viscerally grabbing. They sort of get you in your stomach. So it's interesting to process them through your eyes that way.
Right, right.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I mean, your work is so obliquely political. I mean, it's about sort of political issues, about authority and power. And then, you know, those ideas are so inescapable in current events, and sort of every time you turn on the news, those large scale issues are, you know, ever present. And I'm just wondering if you find yourself processing that through your work, or it comes out in different ways, or, you know, how is there a direct relationship at all?
Well, I mean, I definitely am. I mean, you know, it's so interesting about our bodies and how much something that at first is a shock, like what's happening right now in Ukraine, for instance, how quickly first your reaction is stop this, let's stop this. And then how quickly the body's mechanisms start self-defending against the shock of it. And then it sadly becomes, as opposed to an interruption of the day, becomes part of the day, which is its biggest, the biggest problems of experiencing reality through this mediated effect. You know, and this is the issue of distance as well, because we are so distant from so much that we can hear about, but we're distanced about it. It becomes very challenging to comprehend, to understand what our reaction should be. In fact, you know, it was interesting because Poland, for instance, was having a different reaction because they are so close. They were finding reasons or desires to react, and they were asked not to. So it's also interesting how distance also propels us to have others act differently. But of course, you're asking about painting. My personal position, which is someone who was born, raised in Iran, and has migrated to the US, Oregon, then Europe, East Coast, then West Coast, is quite it's quite a kind of a full round one. So my positions in relation to, I guess I recognize power structures in different places as different as coming from different sources. So in that, I have tried to engage that in the paintings so that they do become complicated, in that in moments where you know there's a power dynamic between kind of a character or so, that changes sometimes with scale, sometimes with scale, sometimes with the narrative that's happening. So to say that, I guess my own personal criticism or personal challenges to challenge the power structures that be are multifaceted. So, I challenge, let's say, gender biases within my own culture. Then I challenge racial biases within the American context and the Middle East. Then so you become kind of, you realize where is, how are you going to punch up? Where is up and where is down in the context that you're in? So that, so you're kind of giving the full, you have the full problem. And of course, then it's just painting, and who knows what it's going to do. I mean, that's the thing. I can't suggest that the paintings are doing anything, because it's always about what it's doing for whoever's looking at it, who's coming with their own subjectivity, right? Back to the whole thing of, I didn't want to prepare a speech because that would be being too sure of what I were to say about the paintings. And that was not, in a way, kosher enough for me.
Mhm.
Yeah. So kind of malleability is also needed, I guess.
Sort of in the same vein, and this may be a ridiculous question, and you can just dismiss it, but I mean, I'm curious when I look at so many pictures of your work, and I look at your work itself, the same imagery kind of pops up again and again. You have these figures that you keep using, these old men, these bald men, and these kids. Do you see them at all? I mean, how much of a life do they have for you? Like, how much are the characters to you? Are you invested in them at all, or are they just simple?
They're no, in a way, there are some artists that do create realities in their work, like, you know what I mean? So then that becomes a reality, a character within that space. For me, they're more shorthand. So for me, they don't really occupy a consistent space. They're more, and if they do look consistent, it's because I trust my own shorthand, if you will, of painting. So they have like a kind of they do become familiar on that level in terms of the hands gesture. But in terms of, for me, that my mental space is definitely tries to be more rooted in reality, and the paintings become a way of expressing something about that through painting. They don't exist on a plane of their own. They're just I shouldn't even say they. There is no they, right? Ideas, paintings, and ideas that just get squished from the brain of ideas. So they're much more, for me, they're conceptual paintings. Mm-hmm. They're not, there's no line through, in a way. Yeah.
A couple questions from the audience. A couple questions about your idea of the blur.
Yeah.
And someone talking about how they avoid putting on their glasses because they actually like that experience of filtering out some information. And is that for you a way to avoid processing too much information, or can you talk about that a bit? And someone else asking about the blur and nostalgia, which is something that you are fighting against, but blur has a nostalgic kind of feel to it.
Definitely. So one way of trying not to sort of lean into the blur nostalgia is not to use, for instance, photographic images to paint the blur. So I use the idea of a fan or something, or not to use the same techniques. If I think one of the ways to try best not to fall, perhaps not even unknowingly, into nostalgia is to try not to use the same techniques that have been used, and to kind of sort of jump over and find another tool, if you will. For me, the extraction of the blur was it's also the security of not being definite. So the kind of indefiniteness of the mark, just to think very, very bluntly about when you make a mark, it's definite there. It's definitely there. And the desire for it not to simply be definite, to have a jumping effect, to have, was I here? Was I there? Are you sure I was here? To have space for inclarity, a kind of, I guess, maybe even a distrust of what seems to be quite clear. I guess it's also a suggestion that what we think is clear is not so clear, or it might not be what's the word I'm looking for? For it to be less than what it promised to be, let's say. So clarity is less than what it promised. So let's maybe play, or at least think about that space of unclarity, and think about that for a bit. And how are we going to sit with that? It might pendulum us to a more needing of a better clarity. So sometimes you need to go somewhere so that you can jump, in fact, where you need to, with a better trajectory, right? So it's also, there's that, but now we're in abstract speech mode, and I hope everyone's okay with it.
Does that change at all when you're working in painting versus animation? Or do those do different things for you?
They do. In a way, animation is my way of being really okay with, let's say, this format of sharing work. So because the animation doesn't have a physical presence, it's always mediated. And the kind of animation I make is not cinematic in the same way that some works need to be. So that I'm really okay with sharing it in the kind of mediums that we can use right now. That's the facility of animation, and it goes from A to B. But no, the blur, it's interesting. I did come to the blur. There was an animation that I used where they were going behind the glass, and I enjoyed the blur. But it's not in the function of the animation itself. Narratives can be blurring or clarifying. Certainly the image notion of a blur is just one way, but we can have a blurring conversation. We can have a blurring narrative where nothing is clear. Reminds me of many Buñuel films, Terminating Angel, where nobody could leave the party and they had no idea why. That's one of the most beautiful blurs that I can think of reality. So yeah. But no, but quite clearly, actually, to your point, my animations, in fact, don't use the blur. They deal so much with the problem of you're doomed, you do or you don't. There's no escape, it seems, in the animations for me. There's a cycle of being a bit hit the ground on some level with something, with some force. And that's what I'm preoccupied with mostly in the animations. And it is quite interesting what artworks do. Kimberger thought that, I don't know if he really thought that, because you can never trust an artist, what they say, but he suggested that making artworks can really change the artist, but they can't do anything else. So to that, I suggest everyone should go and make their own work, whatever it is. of course, Kirenberger's work changed me a lot, so I know that what he's saying is not true, but there is something to that of so much of what you do, you know, helps you in so many ways. Who the hell knows what it does after that, you know? Yeah.
Another formal question, kind of escaping boundaries and blurring, a question about your use of the corner in paintings. What's the purpose of that, and what what result are you aiming to generate with that?
I kind of wanted, well, I was, you know, this idea of a power dynamic came into play, and this idea of one thing is making the other one, and the projector. To some extent, it was also a little bit of cinema envy. I can say the corner paintings are definitely Los Angeles paintings. You know, every city changes you as a maker, and there's something about cinephiles in this city that are really cinephiles. And as a painter, I became very interested in an audience that was that emphatically, you know, pro or against something that they liked. They were that passionate about it, you know, to boo or to applaud like there's nothing else. And so they were, you know, their format is 16:9. There's a bit of a cinematic format to their scale, and they do use the idea of projections. So I wanted, I guess, the paintings to kind of speak to each other. I wanted to kind of stay out of it, suggest that I'm staying out of it, and to also activate this third axle that is invisible between the triangle, within the triangle. That is us then looking at it, or our projections, which is always present in painting. Whenever, of course, someone's in front of it, there is that access. It becomes dynamic. But it was a play. I mean, you know, you're a problem solver as a painter. You create a problem, then you have to solve it for yourself. So, yeah, in a way, a really good painting lecture would be me taking everyone's problem in the audience and solving it one by one. That could be the next lecture, because that's what I'm good at. I'm good at problem solving. I'll solve your problems for you. Yeah.
Could you talk a bit more about your interaction with media and social media and the sort of avalanche of information that we're kind of, you know, faced with all the time?
It's very interesting. Well, it's to be seen. You know, I think if I were to be positive, first, I would say it's giving a lot of power to individuals behind the screen. So there's not one source of the broadcast. You know, everyone can broadcast. So there's a lot of empowering that's happening with everyone having their own channel, right? That's interesting, I think. What's difficult is to then become your own best editor, to become your own best audience, to kind of to retain faculties that are critical, so that we as audiences are not so easily persuaded from one form to another, but can hold discretion and can hold a kind of value structure and history. So it's always an issue of how much can we retain of the history, so that actually what we make is fresh, and that it's not just fresh in our minds because we don't know about the past, but it's in fact the best thing that we can make. That becomes a challenge with the cacophony and the kind of non-editing that's happening with social media. In terms of, yeah, so that's kind of where I'm thinking about, it's allowing there's a lot of proficiency, image proficiency that's happening because we're so bombarded with images. I think the generations that are younger than me have such a sense of images, a much more, I would say, savvy, a much more efficient sense of images. So the challenge, I think, for this generation is to go beyond the image. So because image becomes easy, because now we learn it, now we understand how to make sexy images very easily. So how do we go beyond the attractions? And this is what I mean about the glitz and the glamour, and how painting, the problem of having to look so good, I think, is a real something to be really, you know, grapple with. to try to not be seduced by the need to look good to get attention, but to actually hone in the belly of whatever it is that you're interested in. So yeah, I think this will, be where we have to go, basically.
Well, that's a perfect segue into another question from an audience member who's interested in you talking about your interest in the scatological.
Oh, yes.
Why so much? Why so much feces?
Can we say why so much feces? Feces. I mean, the lecture could have been about feces. It was very difficult to think how to organize this talk. Which direction should we go to? Feces in the canon. Feces. Well, we have feces. There they are. It works in multiple ways for me. Again, it's not one directional. So I do like to think about it both up and down, both as a source of something positive and as actually, feces. Can we say bad words on this public broadcast? Can we say the word? Should we not?
I think we should try to avoid it.
Okay. So that's kind of why I like to paint it, because we have to avoid it. So in a way, I guess a lot of my general argument in painting is if we can embrace the things that we judge as lesser in ourselves, would be a happier society. So the freedoms that I use to paint, the freedom of this lecture being what it was and not more, the freedom of painting loosely, and the freedom with which the figures act within the paintings are all arguments for accepting the baser self. And so feces became, I guess there is a history in the paintings on how feces evolved. A few first times I couldn't actually paint the feces. I was too nervous. So they don't look like anything. I put them in enema bags, and some figures were giving themselves, enemas. And it was for me a way of kind of a therapy, kind of distilling. You're bringing your insides out and you're processing your own stuff. That was some of the first ways that it came out. Then it felt productive. Then it felt, Bill Gates is right now trying to deal with it. When you deal with SHIT, I guess tomato seeds don't get processed, and you can have tomato plants growing out of feces. So there is, they become fertile, and they are, you can plant more things with fertile stuff. Then it changes. Then it changed to, I guess, Shipmom. That I kind of say that's the title of the series. I can't avoid it. And that came about. I've talked about it before. Kind of dealing with. I just painted a painting. I wanted to paint mother and child. I painted it. It was awful. I wiped the mother figure, and it became. It looked very muddy at the time, and so I thought that I could live with that. That's something that is. It seemed bizarre that we hadn't had that before. That we hadn't had a kind of iconoclastic image of the Madonna, basically. That we haven't killed our mothers. That we do it so often in trying to grow through therapy or something, but that we hadn't in the language of images. That it was still taboo to kill the maternal. Much more so than to kill the father, which was really interesting. So I wanted to do that in a way. And then I thought the figure, the maternal figure, the Shipmom was quite okay with it. It wasn't so some of it is, but in the history of art, again, people have really dealt with actual feces in their work. So I am fascinated by the reaction to an image of, right? In the same way that if you paint flowers, they don't smell good, they still smell like oil paint. Painting feces still smells like oil paint. I mean, it is paint. It's assigned to something. But that's also interesting how our brain operates with those signs. So I think we have a 5-minute remaining. I don't know if I should go on or if there's anything else that we should wrap up with another question. Sarah.
Have you, I'm sorry, I'm thinking, thinking more about feces. I'm thinking about Chris O'Feely. And some,
the elephant dogs, exactly.
Yeah, someone asking questions if you had actually ever tried or considered using.
You know, in fact, I am quite feces unfriendly. Couldn't tell from my paintings, but in fact, I can't even watch horror films. I mean, I have a lot of what you could say violence in the paintings, but I can't bear like horror films. It's too scary. So sometimes what we output is very different than what we can intake as well.
Interesting. And I guess the final question, yes, it's so interesting to hear you to talk about your work like this, but I only have time for one more. But another question about nostalgia, which keeps coming up, this your approach to contemporary life and to nostalgia, and if you think that there's anything positive that can be gained from nostalgia, or if there's any value.
I'll say this. It's if there are artists who are listening, and if this is posing a kind of a friction for them, not to suggest that it is, but if in case, I think it's interesting to examine why we're drawn to nostalgia and romantic notions of painting. I think it's a space to really investigate our own psychological needs of why the past is more comforting than the unknown future. I don't want to suggest that a way of painting is, you can have a very traditional approach to painting and still not be nostalgic. For instance, I can think of, let's say, a painter like Kurt Kauper, who's deeply invested in traditional ways of painting, but whose paintings are definitely nuanced and fresh when you look at them. So they're not leaning into seductions of nostalgia and, oh, look at me enjoy this kind of brush mark. And I guess there's nothing wrong with that, absolutely, but that has a function. And that the function of that is a certain kind of band-aid, but it doesn't, but it is conservative. And I guess, you know, with the political atmosphere that we're in, with political parties, you know, pulling on our nostalgic, emotional needs, like Trump, etc., or anybody, you know, who does that. The good old days. I think that is something to be quite aware of, and there is pop culture that creates. We can always watch reruns, you know, and feed that. And as culture producers, what can we do? What other kind of bandages can we imagine that help us, but don't lean into the same conservative waves of being, basically? It's a thing. It's there. There's no answer, but that everybody can for themselves find ways of trying to come up with something for that. And, you know, I just have to say this, there's, you know, when you study, there's always these things of, you can never make anything new. Everything's been done. People say that to you. And I think that's just a horrible education. That's bad education. I do think if you think that, that's true. But I think if we just stop thinking that, then there might be something else there as well. So, haha.
Well, that's an optimistic note to end on.
To our brushes. Yes. Here, let's go to our easels. Yes.
Thank you, Tala. That was really wonderful.
Well, thank you so much to the audience, and to Smithsonian for holding this. I wish we could do it in person. Thank you.
Next year.
Next year.